Welcome, everyone. My name is Hans Gustafsson, and I have the honor to serve as the director of the J. Phillips Center for Interreligious Studies at the University of St. Thomas here in Minnesota. We're delighted to have you join us today, and for the next hour is the first of a two-part series featuring Dr. Damian Costello. Today, Dr. Costello will speak about Nicholas Black Elk, his story, history, legacy, and vision, and then a week from today, at the same time, with a different Zoom link, of course, Dr. Costello will shift focus a little to the relationship between Christianity and Indigenous American traditions, especially insofar as how Christians can listen and learn directly from their Indigenous neighbors. This series is organized and sponsored by the J. Phillips Center for Interreligious Studies at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the J. Phillips Center for Interfaith Learning at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. I want to thank Dr. John Merkel, the director of the J. Phillips Center at St. John's University, for his collaboration and effort in organizing this series with us. Now, we had planned this event to take place about a year ago, but like so many things due to the pandemic, we had to postpone it till now. And this series was initially planned in coordination with two other entities, which I want to thank as well. So I want to thank Sean Phillips, who is the pastoral minister of the Church of Gitchewah-Kateri in Minneapolis, which is a community founded in cooperation with Catholic and non-Catholic Lakota and Ojibwe elders and spiritual leaders. And I want to also thank the Native American Awareness Working Group and Marty Roars, he's the Justice Director in the Justice Office at the Carondelet Center, which is a ministry of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet and Consociates, also in St. Paul, Minnesota. Okay, now, before I introduce Dr. Costello, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the relationship of the land on which the University of St. Thomas exists as the ancestral and current homelands of the Dakota people. The university also recognizes the Ojibwe and Ho-Chunk, whose lands were colonized by the United States and the present-day state of Minnesota. And the University of St. Thomas has recently just approved an official land acknowledgement statement. And I want to invite all of our viewers today to read more about it on the homepage of the Doherty Family College at the University of St. Thomas. There you will find the official St. Thomas land acknowledgement statement. And you can also remain on the lookout for more St. Thomas initiatives and opportunities for Native and non-Native students to engage in curricular, co-curricular, and community-engaged learning that focuses on First Nation and Indigenous American studies and relations. A couple of housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. We hope to have time after the presentation. We hope to have time for questions. We will aim to be done by 12:45 p.m. Central Time. So even though the chat function has been disabled at the bottom of your screen, you are certainly welcome and very much encouraged to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And you can submit questions at any point during the conversation, and those will be collected for Dr. Costello after the presentation. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Costello, who specializes in the intersection of Catholic theology, Indigenous spiritual traditions, and colonial history from a post-colonial perspective. He is an internationally recognized expert on the life and legacy of Nicholas Black Elk, and some of you may know about him from his book by the title Black Elk, Colonialism and Lakota Catholicism by Orbis Press. More recently, he has published articles on Indigenous relations, Catholicism, and Black Elk for America Magazine. And just last year, he was an academic advisor and associate producer for the documentary Walking the Good Red Road, Nicholas Black Elk's Journey to Sainthood, which aired on ABC affiliates. Currently, Dr. Costello is on faculty of NATES, or formerly known as the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies, and he is a founding member and the American co-chair of the Indigenous Catholic Research Fellowship, or ICRF, which focuses on Indigenous Catholicism, interreligious relations, reconciliation, and solidarity. So please join me in virtually welcoming Dr. Damian Costello. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Gustafsson. Welcome everyone to this lecture, the first part. And I just want to go over a few housekeeping things real quick before we begin our talk. Today, we're really going to focus on who Black Elk is and why he's important. Really the story of his life, the sort of focal points, the fulcrums of the events that really shaped him, and what we can take from that for the next week, which is the content of his teachings and what that means for us today. And so, and what do I mean by us? I speak as a settler. I'm from settler descent. I'm a Catholic theologian. And so I think about what these teachings can help the Catholic Church, Christian people, settlers to reassess about our own traditions, and relearn who we are. So we're going to be looking a lot at Lakota traditions, talking about indigenous people, but I want to make sure that our priority is understood, that we're doing so not so much to, definitely not to take them, to appropriate them, to make them part of our practice, but to use them as a lens to look at who we were and who we can become, restoring right relationship and becoming active partners in a healing process that too often we don't recognize. So before we start, we should start in the way that Black Elk always did, even with non-native people like, I speak for myself, for me, when seekers like I showed up, the Black Elk, he said, no, first we must do this in the Lakota way. We must offer the sacred pipe. So I invite you to center yourself, put yourself in a quiet place, and listen to the words, the prayer of Black Elk, as he makes relations with all the powers of the universe through his prayer. Grandfather, Tunkashila, Great Spirit, you have been always, and before you no one has been. There is no other one to pray to but you. You yourself, everything that you see, everything has been made by you. The star nations all over the universe you have finished. The 4 quarters of the earth you have finished. The day, and in that day, everything you have made. On earth, everything you have done. Grandfather, Wakantanka, lean close to the earth so that you may hear the voice I send. A nation we shall make. Without difficulties, we shall make it. Toward the west where the sun goes down, behold me. The thunder beings, behold me. Where the giant lives in the north, there is power with the buffalo, so I heard. Behold me. To the east, where the sun shines continually with the elks, behold me. To the south, where you always face a man with power, behold me. To the depths of the heavens, so I heard, an eagle with power, behold me. To Mother Earth, Unchimaka, it is said, you are the only mother that has shown mercy to your children. Most of us know a lot, or at least know the stereotype of the Lakota people who Black Elk came from. They came out of actually the region where St. Thomas is, out of southern Minnesota and into the plains, into the Dakotas, right here, and into eastern Montana and Wyoming. And they have the privilege and burden of being the most famous native North Americans on the planet. We've all seen Dances with Wolves, at least the older ones here in this talk. That's Black Elk's people. Buffalo hunters on horseback, headdresses, lived in teepees. And Black Elk was of the Oglala Band. He was a second cousin of Crazy Horse, the famous war and spiritual leader. Well, one day when he was following the buffalo, he grew up while the Lakota were still free and following the buffalo herds. People are on the move. It was summertime, and they stopped to get a drink of water, Black Elk and his friends. And at the stream, he took a drink of water and he fell down and couldn't get up. His friends called his family. They set up the teepee, and Black Elk went unconscious. And he laid unconscious for 12 days. What in the Western way we would say he was in a coma. But what Black Elk remembered and experienced was hearing a voice. Behold, the sacred voice is calling you, he heard. And so he went outside and he looked up in the sky and he saw these 2 men descending from the sky. And a little cloud came down and he got on it and he followed them up, where in the heavens, the 4 nations, the 4 horse nations danced for him of the 4 directions. And they brought him to the teepee of the 6 grandfathers. And you heard Black Elk's pipe prayer, the prayer to the 6 directions. The grandfathers represented the 6 directions. Just in Christian theology, we have the understanding of three persons in one God. In the Lakota way, the six grandfathers represents the powers of the universe, Wakantanka. And even in Sundance songs today, you'll hear the grandfathers of each direction referred to. So they called Black Elk in, and they said, nephew, grandson, you have been called. Your people are in great difficulty. And they gave Black Elk a number of different objects. They gave him a sacred bow. They gave him a pipe. They gave him a cup of water. And they gave him ultimately two powers: the power to destroy. And here he is. He's leading the people down the black road of difficulty, where he slays the blue man who was drought. And they gave Black Elk the power to heal, and told him that he would renew the people. He would lead them down the sacred red road, a very common image that you'll hear across Native North America today, that symbolizes the good way of life. And the people who had been suffering, who were going through troubles, would arrive at the sacred tree at the center of a sacred hoop. And at the center of that sacred hoop, the tree would bloom. It would flower, the grandfathers told him. And Black Elk, in the midst of his vision, when he gets to the sacred tree and he sees his people there at the tree, the circle of his people, he looks around, he sees the circles of all the peoples around him, of the whole world. And then he jokes when he was giving the interviews, he's like, I don't know if I saw the sacred hoop of the white people, but he did. He said, I did. They were there too. This was the renewal of all of creation, all of people, that Black Elk was somehow called to. And so after 12 days of going down the black road and the red road and seeing the renewal of all creation, Black Elk is sent back to earth. Here he is again with a sacred tree at the center of the medicine wheel here, and the people with him participating in this pilgrimage. And he's brought back to earth, and there's this beautiful image of him walking back to his teepee. Everything is still now. All the spirits are gone. And he's wondering what happened. He's 9 years old. He walks into the teepee and he sees himself laying there. He was still unconscious. His parents and his family was sitting over him, and they thought he had died. So he goes back into his body, and he wakes up, and the people were overjoyed. And Black Elk was scared out of his mind. Now, most of us know that in Lakota way and indigenous ways, visions are a crucial part of religious life, of the spiritual way, but they're usually prepared for. They're usually done in ceremony first. They're brought out to the vision quest, the Hamblecha, in a remote place. You're prepared for that. And when you do experience a vision, you're brought back, and the elders help you interpret that. And Black Elk had none of that. He was only 9 years old. He only probably knew that it was a big burden that he had received a vision. Even today, Lakota people will say, if you haven't been given a vision, don't ask for one. It entails a calling to a very difficult way of life, usually to be a healer, but also something more, often something more. Black Elk knew that a lot of Lakota ceremonies had been given through visions. He recounted in the sacred pipe that the Sundance had been given in visions. And he knew that it was a difficult way of life. And so he pushed it aside. He tried to drive it out of his mind. And there was a lot going on. This was the era of the Great Sioux Wars, as we say in American history. He was 12 years old in 1876 at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and he participated in the aftermath. He finished off 2 soldiers and scalped them. Here's Custer. This is the Anheuser-Busch depiction of course, the valiant white warrior in control to the end, even when he falls. And here's the native depiction of the aftermath. This was the last great victory for the Lakota and their Cheyenne or Arapaho allies. And after this, it was very easy for the U.S. government to get funding for the war effort. This was 1876, the 100-year anniversary of America. People thought that Manifest Destiny had been completed. This was in the midst of nationwide celebrations, celebrating America's triumph, when they got news of Custer, their media darling, being killed on the Great Plains. So anyway, they tripled the war effort, the budget. They quickly shattered Lakota resistance. Black Elk followed, with his family, followed Sitting Bull up across the what they call the medicine line. Native peoples knew that there was this arbitrary line drawn in the dirt that the U.S. government, the U.S. Army could not follow. It was called Grandmother's Land. And the Canadian authorities granted asylum to the Lakota people, despite the Canadian natives, the Blackfeet, other tribes. Game was dwindling there too. The extra competition that Lakota presence gave for the limited resources, but they honored Sitting Bull and the Lakota refugees. And to this day, this is Wood Mountain right here, a very small Lakota reservation just over the border. Black Elk made it 4 years. It was a very difficult time, difficult winters, lots of snow, not a lot of food. And finally, after 4 years, Black Elk and his family decided to surrender. They walked back about 1,000 miles to Pine Ridge, where they were forcibly settled by the government. And on the way, Black Elk surrendered to the spirits. This is about 8 years later after his vision. The spirits had been hounding him. They had been pursuing him to activate, to accept his calling, his sacred calling, to help the people to live, to make the people live. The thunder beings had been pursuing him, calling him at night. He woke up in the morning, he'd run out of the teepee, not knowing what to do, and his parents thought that he was losing his mind. So they called a medicine person in, and Black Elk finally broke down and told his vision to the medicine person. And so in order to actualize that vision, they embodied it in ceremony. They got the whole village together to recreate Black Elk's vision, down to the 6 grandfathers and the sacred cloud teepee, to the people processing down the sacred red road. And at the end, Black Elk at the age of 16 was recognized as a traditional healer and served as a medicine man for a good portion of his life. Well, he settled in Pine Ridge. We'll talk a little bit about what that was like. Very difficult, especially the transition. And in the midst of the transition, this very counterintuitive opportunity came to Black Elk and other young people on Pine Ridge and some other reservations. Buffalo Bill Cody was really America's second celebrity after George Custer. He understood, he had served on the plains, that as much as Americans, settlers, were scared of Native peoples, wanted to eradicate their presence, wanted to strip them of their culture and appropriate their land, they knew that we were and are fascinated with Native peoples. And he knew that it sold. So he got together a group and formed what was essentially a traveling circus that would travel from city to city, the major metropolitan areas and the East Coast of the US and then in Europe, that would recreate scenes from the West and from Native life. So here we have a buffalo hunt being recreated. They recreated the Battle of Little Bighorn with Custer winning, unfortunately. They danced, they recreated a Native village, and people after the shows could come and visit and got to know the performers like Black Elk. And, you know, when I first encountered this, I was sort of very skeptical. This sounded very much like something like third world tourism to me, right? Like maybe going to Jamaica and seeing the reggae band, right? Is that really authentic culture? Are people really free? Is this really something we should be doing? Those are the very legitimate questions that we can't put aside. But the more I dug into it, the more it seemed that people like Black Elk who participated saw it as a real opportunity. They were paid very good wages, comparatively speaking, and especially in comparison to their relatives back home who were earning nothing, who had no employment opportunities. They got to see the world, and they got to inhabit Native life and culture in a public way. And they also got to see the white world from the inside. And Black Elk very intentionally chose to join the Wild West show for that reason. He said he wanted to go for all the reasons his friends were going, but he saw it as a spiritual opportunity to investigate the white man's world to see if there was anything of value to bring back to his people, if there was any power there. For if there was, that should be appropriated to use so that the people may live. He saw it as an extension of his calling to be a holy person and to fulfill his vision. So he spent 3 years. He went to New York, where they sold out Madison Square Garden for 4 months. Then they went on to Europe. They had the choice to return home. Black Elk and almost everybody else continued on. They went to Europe, and they went to London. Here he is in his regalia with a friend, which was the center of the entire world at this point. The largest city on the planet, 4 million people, and the center of the largest empire the world has ever known, covered about 25% of the world's land area. And it was also in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. So this was where you can see the coal burning factories there. There's accounts that the native performers would send back and say, this is a very strange place. You can go months without seeing the sun. This is when animals still moved most of what was moved in the city. And so you had tons and tons, thousands of tons of manure produced by animals in the streets every day. This was before sewage. So when we say London, our default setting often has us think of something like Downton Abbey, very precise lawns and, big estates and upper class genteel society. This is actually something very much more like Calcutta or Lagos or Port-au-Prince today. And so it was a very traumatic experience for people coming from the Great Plains to encounter this. But it was also an opportunity to meet new people. And they would interact with ministers, they'd interact with young people. A lot of them fell in love, including Black Elk. He almost brought his girlfriend home, his good friend, Stephen Standing Bear, who painted the pictures for Black Elk's vision, did bring his Austrian wife home, and she became a pillar of the Pine Ridge economy and stayed there the rest of her life. And they also investigated Christianity. They would go to churches and wanted to learn more about it. And of course, the ministers are very intent on trying to convert the heathen, but the Lakota surprised them. They went to Westminster Abbey. 40 of them were not sure if Black Elk was part of the group. I suspect he was, since he was very intentionally investigating the white man's religion. And they sang "Nearer My God to Thee" in Lakota, a hymn that had been translated in Minnesota, I think in the 1850s, and had sort of been percolating and spreading around all of the Dakota, and Lakota's peoples as sort of a new way of expressing relationship with death. Anyway, after 3 years, Black Elk came home, and he came home in June, and in December wrote a very poignant letter. I think probably a lot of us have had abroad experiences or traveling experiences, and we know that it's not necessarily in the moment when you are in the midst of your travels that you understand what's happening. It's usually afterwards, when you've come back to where you're from and you've had a chance to look at your experience and distill what remains important. What can you take away from it? And so Black Elk wrote a letter in Lakota to the Lakota people, and he said, I traveled for 3 years in the white man's world. It was very different. It was very difficult. A lot of their ways are extremely difficult. But there's one thing of value that I found, and it was the white man's beliefs about God's will. And he goes on to quote this beautiful passage here, 1 Corinthians 13, love. That was the essence of what the white man's world had for Black Elk and the Lakota people from his perspective. Now we should jump in right here and clarify very quickly that Black Elk is not saying that I've never heard of this idea of love before. Of course, Lakota people, indigenous people, non-Christian people have very thick, clear ideas about compassion and love. But what Black Elk is talking about is maybe a new twist, seeing love in a new way that speaks to the situation that the Lakota people are in back in the reservation situation. So that's what we'll take forward. So while he's gone, before he left, and then while he's gone, things went from bad to worse. And so just in silence for 20 seconds, we're going to look at the changing map of Lakota lands here. Now, this doesn't look too bad. When I was looking at reservations in my Rand McNally travel atlas when I was in college in the 90s, I'd see reservations on the map in big orange blocks, and I'd say, wow, that's a lot of land. You know, there must be a lot of space for natives to do what they do. Well, when you actually zoom in, most reservations are checkerboarded. The last and most insidious part of the reservation system was to break down tribal land holdings into individual holdings, usually 40 or 160 acres, and parcel them out to families and then sell off or just give away the rest to non-native populations with the justification that it would help natives adjust to what they wanted to occur, which was to shift towards farming and cattle raising, but really just to have more land available for exploitation. So Black Elk returns, and we should just say we unfortunately can't talk too much about the reservation system as a whole. I think most of us know that there's a very unjust situation, plenty of social issues and problems, but it was only when I became a very active participant in my own community, in community life, of helping to build and maintain the institutions that I took for granted as a kid my whole life, whether it's my daughter's, my children's preschool, or the library, or any other part of our community, our church. You don't realize how much work goes into just keeping the doors open. And the whole reservation system was designed to break those institutions, to not support them, but to work against them, to do the exact opposite of what a community needs to thrive, down to where the people live. And so Lakota, when they set up their camps, they would set the teepees up in a circle, sacred circle, and on the reservation, they very intentionally spread people out in isolated cabins to keep them from rebelling. And so issues of depression are linked to that very material design of the reservation system today. Anyway, Black Elk returned. He got a job due to his sort of minimal English as a store clerk. And while he was working there, he continued his healing practice. We'll talk a bit more about that. He got news of the ghost dance. This is out west in Nevada, a Paiute by the name of Wovoka, the woodcutter, had a vision. He was very influenced by Mormons and was very intrigued by this idea of Jesus, and at some point had a vision of a Messiah. He had the vision of Christ being Indian, of being native. And he told Wovoka that I came to the white people once and they killed me. I've heard the cries of my native children, and I will come back. I will heal the land. I will bring back the buffalo. I will bring back the fish, in his case, where he lived. I am coming soon. I will bring back your dead relatives. All you have to do is dance this new dance, a circular dance, usually with a tree symbol in the middle, like a pole. And he gave Wovoka new songs, some sacred red paint. And he said, do what they ask you in addition to this dance. Send your kids to school, work as hard as you can, do the best you can, and go to church. Going to this dance and going to church is like two churches, the same way. And this movement spread out into all of the plains and the Rocky Mountain era. And this is a quick quote here from Nick Estes. We'll talk a bit about him later, who was a Lakota academic, which I think really captures the sort of revolutionary impulse of Wovoka's message and what people heard. Here you can see the message ricocheting out. Walker River was where he was from. Went across the plains, and ironically, it was through children who had been through the boarding school system already, who could speak English, who could write letters, who could travel the train, and had friends on other reservations. They really fueled the expansion of this idea. And you can also see that Pine Ridge was an epicenter of the Ghost Dance movement. Now, interestingly, this will be relevant for next week, the Lakota translation for Messiah, Wanikia, he who makes live, is the spiritual essence of what the Messiah does. And Black Elk heard the message. He was very skeptical at first. He didn't know what to think. It was not traditional, but he kept hearing about it, so he decided to go investigate, like he did with everything in his life. He was very cautious, but very deliberate. He watched for a while. He said, this kind of looks like my vision. He decided to participate. He became a full dancer. And after a full day of dancing in the hot sun, with no water, no food, he fell down and had his last major vision of his life, where he flew over the promised land to the sacred tree, where he saw an Indian with his hands and feet pierced, who gave him a message, who said, everything has been given to me by my father. You must say this. Black Elk returns to his people. He becomes a major leader in the Ghost Dance. And unfortunately, Nick Estes talked about the distortion. There were two things that you could do as a native during the reservation period that would cause settlers like me, like those of us watching, to just lose our minds, that we had no context to understand or interpret. And one of them was to dance. The reservation authorities saw the dancing and they assumed that it meant Lakotas were rejecting everything about the reservation, number one, and two, they were getting ready to revolt. So they called in the U.S. Army. Misunderstandings and tension led to Wounded Knee Massacre 4 days after Christmas in 1890, where a group of refugees from Standing Rock under Bigfoot were massacred by Custer's old regiment. So in effect, in at least publicly, it shattered the Ghost Dance. Black Elk and the rest of Lakota did their best to sort of move on. It was a very tough couple years after Wounded Knee. Black Elk got married. He had some kids, and he continued, despite the tragedy, to listen and pursue the call he had given, his great vision. He continued as a traditional healer, which we'll talk more about next week. We don't have a lot of time to get into the detail right now, but he was a active traditional healer at least until 1904 when he became Catholic, possibly later. A very important part of the story, which we'll be able to dig into more next week. He also became Catholic, which I think for most of us is very surprising. It was surprising to me when I first heard this. I came to Black Elk, read Black Elk Speaks because of the native story. I didn't expect him to be Catholic. I thought, in fact, he was the opposite of what I associated with Catholicism. But in 1904, he became Catholic, and after a couple years of intense devotion and self-motivated study of Scripture, he learned to read Lakota himself and became proficient in using and quoting Scripture and telling the story. He was promoted to the role of catechist, we'll talk about in a minute. But Lakota Catholicism sort of scrambled my expectations about what I thought Catholicism was. You know, I think a lot of us have the expectation that Catholicism is what they say it was in the 1950s in America. There are literally thousands of other types of Catholicism that look very, very different, including Lakota Catholicism. Now, first and foremost, we should be very clear and upfront that this was in part a government program. They ran the boarding school and were complicit in the colonial program of the US government on Pine Ridge. But we need to complicate it at least a little bit, what the Jesuits primarily did to implicitly challenge our sort of settler expectations. The Jesuits who served there were not even American. They were actually refugees from Germany. They'd been kicked out of Germany. So they didn't speak English and found it easier to learn Lakota. And so all the early Jesuits spoke Lakota, and our early linguistic work comes from them. They used the term Wanikia to translate Savior. And so that all the prayers, all the ritual that occurred in Lakota Catholic circles used the same idea that the ghost dance had for the Savior, allowed Lakota people to import those ideas, to transfer them from the ghost dance into their Catholic worship. And they essentially occupied a sort of complex middle ground. The way I like to put it is to say that they were the least bad options available. If you were a Lakota person and you weren't in the residential school, which sort of came later, if you looked around, they were the ones who did the most to understand your culture, to speak your language, and were generally the most trustworthy. And in fact, Red Cloud invited the Jesuits to Pine Ridge to help educate the children. That's why they ended up there. They also gave significant lay leadership to people like Black Elk. Black Elk served as a catechist, which is like a modern day permanent deacon in our church. And he was very active, very dynamic preacher, lay preacher. He brought over 400 people into the church, and he was a long-term missionary in Yankton and Wind River. I love this quote that his daughter Lucy gives, is that she says, we were in Yankton for so long that when I came back, the kids made fun of me for speaking like a Yanktonite. Anyway, his message, speed this up a little bit, he really incorporated the ghost dance into his message. Here he talks about the different people he met in his ministry. And if you don't know Indian country, you don't necessarily know that the Shoshone and Omaha were traditional enemies of the Lakota people, and also white men, that they are part of this new corporate body because we all suffer on this land, and they're all part of this new heaven and new earth that God has for us. All right, this is where I think most of us come to Black Elk, including me initially. The residential schools, we're going to talk a little bit more about that next week, really had a devastating effect on the younger generations. And where Black Elk could sort of assume in his generation the permanence of Lakota formation in their own lives, it snuck up on them how difficult it would be to pass on the traditions in their desire to have the kids adapt to the new world, to the new reality. It wasn't clear how devastating these systems were. Here is a Navajo young man after only 3 years. So Black Elk took the unprecedented steps to pass on his vision to John Neihart in 1931, and this became Black Elk Speaks. Beautiful, beautiful book, despite its limitations. And what we're going to look at next week, the content of Lakota traditions. What I think is important for us to start thinking about when we think about Black Elk and what his message is for the Catholic Church. That Lakota tradition doesn't just bring peace upon the earth, but between men and all of creation, humanity and creation. We'll look at that next week. All right, so we start wrapping up here. The question is, who is Black Elk? How do we make sense of these very different visions and periods of life that Black Elk lived? Is he at his heart a Lakota traditionalist, and the Catholic stuff more of a veneer that he just adopted for the sake of survival? Was he really a Catholic convert in his heart that gave up all the previous Lakota ways, or was he somehow both? Was he able to integrate both into one way of life? And I think that's where the answer lies, but it requires us unlearning a lot of things that we assume. And I think this perspective that David Troyer, who's from Minnesota, from Leech Lake, Ojibwa, really wants us to think about. We are so used to telling stories about natives from a settler perspective that everything really ended with Wounded Knee. That the only natives that are worth listening to are the ones that we understand as traditional. And David Troyer in this book, I encourage you to go check it out, looks at all of the vibrant history that occurred after Wounded Knee. Life didn't end there. Indian country is strong and vibrant and becoming more so as we speak. And he sees Black Elk's Catholicism as not necessarily a compromise, but as demonstration of his ability to adapt, his vibrancy, and his agency. Nick Estes, who we talked about before, Lakota, picks up on this and it probably challenged me and my perspective of Black Elk's Catholicism, but does talk about Black Elk's commitment to his vision, and that liberation wasn't a one-off effect, a one-off event. It draws from a long history that both projects itself backwards and forward in time. And so the things that Black Elk did that don't necessarily look purely traditional were a part of this way of survival, resistance, and renewal. And I also wanted to bring Reverend Joanne here in because she's Oglala from Pine Ridge, who is in Minnesota, who in the website at the bottom cites Black Elk's vision as part of her spiritual journey. And I think is an example of what she talks about here, uniting ourselves in Christ and our traditions with the voices that cannot be forgotten. Macaw Black Elk is a descendant of Black Elk, and he is the head of he's the executive director of Truth and Healing for Red Cloud Indian School. This is where Black Elk was baptized. It's on Pine Ridge. And he's trying to start a process of healing and being a part of a process of healing and truth and healing for residential school survivors to come to terms with this history. It's very messy and it's not resolved. And he sees Black Elk as somebody who can help Indigenous youth overcome the burden that we project onto them. The ways in which Indigenous youth often feel like they are only defined by and measured up to the standard of purity. And he sees his educational work in Red Cloud as a way to help Indigenous youth to understand that indigeneity fits with everything. Indigenous people are global citizens, and tradition and innovation go together. Black Elk is a model of that. And so these last two things, the last couple thoughts here. Basil Braveheart is a Lakota elder. We're going to talk a lot more about him next week. He does a lot of work in Minnesota, but he was the conduit for changing the Harney Peak, the highest peak in the Black Hills, to Black Elk Peak. And he really highlights Black Elk as a living spiritual presence that transformed this mountain, and whose through it, its vision is going out into the world in a new way. We'll talk about that. And George Looks Twice, his grandson, Black Elk's grandson, he was with Black Elk in the Black Hills in the 30s, when Black Elk was demonstrating the ways for tourists, was responsible for starting the petition that led to the beginning of the canonization process for Black Elk, which is currently in the Vatican. And finally, as we start thinking about next week and what we've seen here, Black Elk is an incredibly complex figure with so many different strands that often seem counterintuitive, that they go together. But what's important about Black Elk and why he's becoming more prominent, both in indigenous circles, but also even in global Catholicism, is the way that he was able to face what was essentially an apocalypse. His entire world collapsed, and he managed to be in that context a real witness of hope. He was able to build bridges. He was able to reach out to the most traditional of his neighbors, to the white seekers who came looking for Lakota ways, and to the ranchers next door, to the businessmen in Rapid City, and pass on a vision of renewal that we all need. Thank you. Oh, and finally, if you're looking for more about his life, this is the link. It's free. It's the documentary. It's online, and pretty well done. You know, nothing's perfect, but if you want to find more details about his life and some of these people that I mentioned, you can find it here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Damian, for that enlightening presentation. And why don't we leave up this current slide so folks can, if they want to quickly jot down that URL address, they're able to do so. So we have about a little over 10 minutes, 12 minutes here for questions, and a number of questions have come in. I see that they're still coming in, so we'll do our very best to get to them. I suppose the ones we don't get to, we can pass along to Damian. At the very least, he'll have them in the back of his mind for next week. So here's a question for you, Damian. When was Black Elk first introduced to Christianity and Christian witness? Were there missionaries at any time in his youth? Or was the Corinthian scripture the first encounter with scripture that left him wanting to know more about it? And that comes in from a viewer.
Great question. That's probably something we will never know for sure. He doesn't talk about it. He may have been around, Father de Smet, the Jesuit, was running around the plains trying to broker peace between the Lakota and the U.S. Army. He may have come in contact with him. But it's probable that his first encounter occurred right before going to Europe. They were required to become baptized as Episcopalians. I don't understand why, other than, a lot of us white Christians, you just have to pour some water on you before we take you seriously as a human being. And so Black Elk was apparently baptized as an Episcopalian before he went to Europe. But I think his first meaningful encounter was in Europe with these dialogues about religion. And that really, just one quick thing to say is that that's a real unique thing about Black Elk and the other performers, is that they had the opportunity to encounter Christianity outside the prison. So many Native people encountered Christianity at this time in the reservation prison. And so that doesn't define Black Elk's Christianity in the way that it does for a lot of other people.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'm in an effort to curate the questions here, because we have several questions that are coalescing around various themes. So there are a number of questions asking about, and I'll try to summarize these, asking about the canonization process of the effort to deem Black Elk a saint. There are questions asking how far along the process is. Have miracles been identified? Are there any surprising discoveries emerging in the process? And then we have one question, which I'll combine with these. One person asks, this is kind of a two-part question that gets to the canonization. This individual prefaces the question by saying, let's see here. In Joe Jackson's book on Black Elk, he claims, paraphrasing, that Black Elk mostly identified with traditional Lakota spirituality and only adopted Catholicism as a survival mechanism. Was Black Elk feigning Catholicism, or was he truly devoted to Jesus Christ and trying to find authentic ways of incorporating Lakota spirituality? And as a follow-up, this individual asks, what would Black Elk say about his canonization in the Catholic Church? Would he be proud of the fact or dismayed that he is profoundly misunderstood? So questions around the canonization effort.
So I'll start with the Joe Jackson question. Very, very good question. Really the core of the issue. There's a lot of different takes on this, and I don't think there's anybody who can speak definitively. I would say, though, that I think Joe Jackson, how can I say this? We want to take Black Elk seriously as a spiritual leader, as someone of authenticity who was committed to his vision. And so I think if we start saying that some things that he did were a show or sort of fake, that I think works against the integrity of who we think he is. So I think first and foremost, we have to respect him as a true spiritual leader. I would also say that when you encounter elders, traditional elders, there is something about ceremony that is first and foremost. Ceremony is always bigger than you. You may not agree with a particular ceremony. You may not participate in a particular ceremony, but if you do, it's because you are engaging with the spirits. If there's something you don't agree with, you stay away from it because it's dangerous. So I think the way that Black Elk engaged the ceremony of the ghost dance, which was about Wanikia, the Savior, and then engaged the ceremony of the Catholic Church, is a statement that he engaged the spirit world authentically through those doorways. That's one way of envisioning how ceremonies work in the Lakota way. So I think if you want to be respectful of the Lakota way, a Lakota ontology, you have to respect ceremony as the foundation. So that's my perspective, and I think there's plenty of Lakota people who would be more sympathetic with Joe Jackson. Regarding the canonization process, it's got stalled with COVID. The first part was approved by the local diocese in Rapid City. The second part was going to the regional bishops, which is the USDCB, unanimous approval. It moved to Rome after all the investigation of his life, all the people who knew him, all their memories, everything he wrote. And so it's in the Congregation for Cause for Saints in Rome as we speak, and we're waiting to hear for some interpretation of that evidence. I have heard credible accounts of miracles, two very directly, both of them in First Nation context, so one in the U.S. and one in Canada. So ones that I find credible. And so right now we're waiting. These can take a long time, hundreds of years. They can take a few years. Now we're hoping Pope Francis can see this in light of, say, the Synod of the Amazon and see it as maybe an important thing to move forward.
Great, thank you. So one of the first question to come in here, I would guess Black Elk thought at the time of his vision that he would play a key role in bringing his people back together again to former times. Yet, the actual story is that the people and nation were disbanded and the culture diluted and almost erased. What do you see as the actual attainment of his vision?
Wow, it's a great question. And I think if Black Elk was here right now, he'd say, great question. I'm still waiting to figure that out. I'm still waiting for that to be revealed. That's something that he struggled with his entire life. What was the final, what was the end game? And was he doing what he needed to participate in that? Now, one thing I will say is that when you read Black Elk Speaks, it ends with a very tragic final vision of him up in the mountain crying, say, the sacred hoop is broken and I didn't do what I needed to do. And you're given the impression that he was broken and that he was really lamenting his failure. That's one thing that Lakota elders are very strongly object to, that there's no way a sacred hoop cannot be broken. And in the Lakota way, you cry as a way of your most sincere prayers are through crying, through tears. And so when Black Elk was crying up in the mountain, that the Nyeheart misunderstood that and cast him as somebody who was lamenting defeat, when in fact he was invoking the continual support and power of the spirits. So I don't know what the end game is, but I would guarantee you that Black Elk did not lose faith and would not see, despite the situation, the challenges that Chettisakoan, the Lakota, Dakota people face. There's progress being made, and he would say that it's not over.
Okay, our next question. What are the responsibilities of scholars to address the issue of genocide and its meaning, its racism for, quote, white colonial settlers in the United States, in U.S. history, for example, reparations? And what are the responsibilities of the U.S. government and white settlers, but especially for Christian discipleship, to decolonize their spirituality, their politics, their participation in such structural injustice? Because the impression in covering the story of Black Elk, for example, by the Catholic Church, there appears to be some fear in describing the stark genocidal actions of what has been done in, quote, in our name.
Amen. That's the question. I mean, that's why I came to this material, because I felt the burden of that question. And it's a endless and seemingly insurmountable mountain, I think, when we all look up at it. And so I don't know that the answer is for sort of the big picture, like reparations, the US government's responsibility, Catholic Church responsibility. But I think the best place to start is making it part of your story. Not saying, I'm on the right side of history, I know the Native perspective, I have the answers, but that this is an unresolved issue that all of us are called to recognize and participate in. This is our story. And to take that serious as part of your spiritual life, and to invite others into that story in a way that they can hear. We like to be strong, and some of us are called to be activists and to be strong and very forceful. But I think a lot of us are called to invite people in a way that they can hear and grow into this calling. This is something that requires a lot of growth. I think it's easy to jump in, get overwhelmed, and then back away. This is something that requires the long haul and a really deep spirituality to maintain that. So all of those things that you brought up, the person who asked that question, reparations, the church's responsibility, doctrine of discovery, those have to be dealt with. They haven't been dealt with yet. But we need people who are willing to make this part of their life in a believable, authentic way. I think Black Elk does that. And I think we're called to do that in some way ourselves. So it's a journey that you're invited to start on, is what I would say, and grow into it.
Well, thank you, Damian, for this wonderful presentation and provoking question and answer period. Unfortunately, we are at our time. We promised to be done at 1:45. There are several questions that have come in that we're just unable to get to. We'll be sure to pass those on to Dr. Costello. Damian, do you have any final words that you want to give us and entice us to come back next week? And by the way, for those of you who want that Zoom link, it is up on J. Phillips Central website. You can register for that optionally if you want it to be sent to you.
I would say there's a lot left undone. And the thing that I find so exciting about Black Elk is what he helps us to unlearn and to recover about who we are. I think when we come to this as settler people yearning to be indigenous to a place, I mean, that's what settlers spiritually need, to be indigenous to where they are. We have tons of resources from our lineages, from our heritage that we haven't seen yet. And so in addition to looking at Black Elk's teachings and what he shows, we're going to be looking at what we can recover so that we can truly be indigenous to where we are, to our history, and be in right relationship or more right relationship with our Indigenous brothers and sisters around us. So that's what's next week.
Well, on behalf of the two J. Phillips Centers at St. Thomas and St. John's, I want to thank you, and I hope to see everybody back here a week from today.